Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to have a look at how to paint a Tabletop Plus Black Templar. This would be great for characters or to create a really unique tabletop army. All the colours I'll be using today will be listed below in the description, so let's get into it. We want to focus our highlights where we can see the light catching, so around the arms, chest, face, shoulders and down the legs. I've left some of the additional components off the model to make painting easier. The colours we'll be using across the bulk of the armour are Abaddon Black and Karak Stone, adding some Corax White for the final highlights. We want the paint to be a layer consistency, so add a small amount of water to help things flow. I begin by mapping out my light placement with about a 90-10 or 80-20 mix of Abaddon Black and Karak Stone, so the difference will be very subtle. I'm using a scratching technique where I apply light pressure and move the tip of the brush in a random pattern where I want the highlight. This will help build texture and add a weathered effect as we layer the paint. If you don't know what layering is, be sure to check out my other video. Adding more Karak Stone, we follow the same scratching process over the first highlight, but we do not want to cover the entire area. When applying the highlights, I'm focusing on the areas where the light is catching to help define the volumes. In the chest, I'm focusing my highlights in the exposed areas and framing the aquila. In the collar, I'm highlighting towards the edges to frame the head. In the shoulders, I'm catching the corners and the apex of each trim. In the helm, I'm working along each side and focusing towards the eyes. And in the backpack, we're just grabbing the areas where the light's catching, so the top of the vents, the top of the centerpiece, and the top edge of the circle. I'm using a 50-50 mix here, and I'm starting to refine the scratching and introduce some stippling. If you don't know what stippling is, I will be covering this in a future video. Again, we're using light brush pressure and building up the texture. Adding Corax White to the mix, I begin to pick out the final primary highlights. I will not be highlighting the inside of the legs with the white mix, just the areas that catch our primary light source. I will still be using light brush pressure and a mix of stippling and scratching to reinforce the texture. And with those last few highlights, the black armor's finished. I think you get a very interesting result with lots of texture and lots of information. For the shoulders, I wanted to create a marbled, almost eggshell looking finish, moving away from the traditional white. Starting with a thinned Karak Stone, I begin to apply this unevenly over the shoulder pads, one knee pad and the centre of the shield. Once dry, I apply a second layer and a third layer of Karak Stone in the same uneven way. With each layer you want to have a mottled finish and allow some of the colour underneath to show through. Adding Wraithbone to the Karak Stone, I start to work towards my highlights and begin to pick out parts of the pattern I want to emphasize. I'm keeping my brush pressure light and thinning my paint while I do this. And repeating this process on the shield. To create shadows and contrast, I use a very thin coat of Karak Stone mixed with Rhinox Hide. I'm applying this in the same mottled pattern as before, into the corners and the lower regions of the shoulder pad. In the shield, I'm applying this towards the center icon and avoiding the edges. To pull everything together, I use a mix of Karak Stone and Wraithbone to create a glaze and apply it all over the marbled surface, pulling my glaze towards the highlights. If you aren't familiar with glazes, please check out my other video. And on the shield, pulling the glazes towards the edges. Here I'm using pure Wraithbone to highlight the brightest points of the shoulder and to really emphasize parts of the pattern that I like. Same with the knee, highlighting towards the brightest point, and with the shield towards the edges. We finish by tidying up the edges using Abaddon Black to line the shoulders, the shield and the knee. This process will create something very unique and something very individual to each model. Starting from a base of Rhinox Hide, I mix Karak Stone and Rhinox Hide and apply it all over the cloth areas. This will act as a foundation for the layers of Karak Stone, which we'll be applying in 2 thin coats to ensure we have even coverage. To highlight the cloth, I use horizontal strokes to create more texture in the model and I focus my highlights on the folds of the material. I repeat this process using a mix of Wraithbone and Corax White, adding more white to pick out the final highlights. Starting from a base of Rhinox Hide, I add some Cadian Fleshtone to start picking out the shapes and the folds of the leather. I want to keep this quite rough and add some texture to the leather. I'm using a mix of long and short fine lines, focusing on the edges, I reinforce these highlights by adding more flesh tone to the mix and working up towards the brightest areas, or the areas where the most wear has occurred. Continuing to add Cadian Fleshtone to the mix, I place my final highlights in the brightest points of the leather or where the most wear has occurred. To finish, I apply an all-over glaze of Rhinox Hide to pull all of the colours together and even out the surface. I wanted to create a simple TMM or true metallic metal effect on the gold. Starting from a base of Retributor Armour, I then applied an all-over wash of Agrax Earthshade to pick out the details. Now I'm taking more Agrax Earthshade and using this like a glaze to emphasise the shapes and the volumes. With the shield, you can see I'm drawing it towards the corners to try and maximise contrast by having a bright spot beside a dark spot. Using Retributor Armour, I start to pick out the highlights in the gold and where the light would naturally catch. When doing this, don't be afraid to thin down your metallic paints to preserve the Agrax Earthshade underneath. Using a 50-50 mix of Retributor Armour and Stromhost Silver, I start to pick out the edges and the prominent details in the gold. For the silver, I start from a base of Leadbelcher and then apply Nuln Oil all over the metal sections. I follow this up with the highlight of Stromhost Silver on the more prominent areas and where the light is catching. Starting from a base of Karak Stone, I apply Agrax Earthshade all over the parchment to establish the shapes and create some definition. Using a mix of Karak Stone and Wraithbone, I highlight the areas where the wash did not settle. I use Abaddon Black to create the script on the parchment. You can see I'm testing the flow and the line size on my thumb before applying to the model. Using the tip of the brush, I create small squiggly lines to indicate text. For the wax seal, I start from a base of Mephiston Red and Abaddon Black. Using Mephiston Red for the first highlight, I apply it to the centre of the wax seal and to the raised edge. Adding Cadian Fleshtone to the Mephiston Red, I add the final highlight. Following the same recipe for the wax seals, I start with a base of Mephiston Red and Abaddon Black, using Mephiston Red for the first highlight. Adding some Fleshtone, I create some highlights on the edges of each panel and at the apex of the curve. Adding some more Cadian Fleshtone, I place the final highlight. For the OSL, or Object Source Lighting, I start by establishing the light by using a mix of Abaddon Black and some white for the first layer, placing this between the coils and towards the bottom. Adding more white, I cover a smaller area and place the brightest points towards the bottom of each of the coils. This will act as the underpainting for the OSL. I'll be doing a more in-depth video on OSL in the future. Apply a glaze of Thousand Suns Blue over the underpainting and over the gun casing beside the coils. Apply a second coat of the glaze to increase the saturation. To finish the gun, use a small amount of Abaddon Black to pick out the top of each coil and to increase the contrast. Starting from Mephiston Red and Abaddon Black, pull the brush along the underside of the lens and towards the inner corner. Repeat this process with Mephiston Red. Adding a small amount of Corax White to the Mephiston Red, repeat the process covering a smaller area. Add some more white to the Mephiston Red and begin to focus on the inner corner of the lenses. To finish, take a small amount of Corax White and add a dot to the corner of each eye. Be confident whenever you apply the dot. To create the OSL on the eye, I create a glaze of Mephiston Red and run this along the underside of the eye and towards the inner section of the faceplate. Repeat this process to increase the saturation. I decided to do a simple diagonal pattern on the emblem, but you can do something more elaborate if you choose. Using Mephiston Red and Abaddon Black, I block out the shape of the pattern. Paint over this with 2 thin coats of Mephiston Red to build saturation. Adding some Cadian Fleshtone to the Mephiston Red, I define the edges of the pattern and the edges of the emblem. And with this, the model's finished. I think this colour scheme and this effect will really make your characters stand out or make for a really unique Tabletop Plus army. Hopefully you found this useful and you can apply it to your army. I think it will create really interesting looking characters or a really unique Tabletop Plus army. If you have any comments, questions or things you would like to see in the future, please drop them below in the comments. I stream a couple of days a week on Twitch if you'd like to stop over and hang out. The links are down below in the description. Until next time. Hopefully you found this useful. Don't forget to like and subscribe.